I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Russell Library at the University of Georgia and the library at Young Harris College. It's Wednesday, January the 28th, 2015, and our guest is Philip Wise, former campaign aide and appointments secretary to President Jimmy Carter, and currently Vice President of Operations at the Carter Center in Atlanta. Welcome, Phil.
Glad to be here.
Well, you've had a long and cordial relationship with the Carters, being from Plains and growing up there.
Yeah, I've gotten to where I introduced myself as being a member of the Lucky Sperm Club. I grew up across the road from some guy to be president one day, and that's kind of how things fell into place. I was blessed. My dad's family moved down from South Carolina in the 1880s to Southwest Georgia to grow cotton, and that's how our family got to be there. The president taught me Sunday school for 4 years. His sons are basically my age. We all grew up together, and I took an early interest in education, which was the major issue that then State Senator Jimmy Carter wanted to be a part of and to influence the state on. And it just was fascinating to me. I got to be a page for him when he was a state senator. When he ran for governor the first time in '66, I got put out on street corners with pamphlets and handed them out to people passing by. And then in 1970, in the second campaign, I was a freshman at Georgia Tech, and I was able basically to walk across the interstate from the Tech campus to campaign headquarters and be a volunteer there. So I was just lucky to have those kind of breaks, and then I got to be a part of the governor's office as first a volunteer and then an intern and then on the staff until he left office in January of '75. Growing up in Plains, small rural community, 600, 700 folks, you get to know pretty much everybody there. And as Mrs. Carter would say, she didn't have to worry about any scandals during any of the campaigns because everybody there already knew everything about them. And I think that was really, really true. It was a great time period to be growing up in a small town.
So you worked in his office when he was governor. Were you surprised when he announced to run for president?
I was surely surprised when I found out that he was going to announce to run for president. I think most of us were. I think I took a big gulp and I thought about it and just went, well, why not? His record and what he was accomplishing as governor was impressive. He was staking out issues that were important, not only within the state, but could be taken to a national level. His progressive positions on any number of social issues, I think, were in sync with the times. Great environmental record, great fiscal conservative, brought a background that I'm not sure people, when he ran for governor, realized what a strong background he brought with his military education and understanding of, frankly, geopolitical issues, and his understanding as a small businessman, and again, what education would mean to the future of the state. And you put all those together and then watch those wonderful political battles that went on inside the legislature of trying to move things forward. And you have to come away sort of thinking, this guy's persistent. He's got some courage, and he can communicate pretty well. As you looked at those, and being a recent college graduate without a lot of other things to do, a presidential campaign sounded like a lot of fun.
So he put you to work.
Well, he did. He did. I was, you know, I'd say this, I guess, with some amount of I hate to say pride, but I will. I was the seventh of 7 people hired in December of '74 to start the campaign, and I helped organize the small office and put together some procedures dealing with financials, reporting, and general organization. And then in June of '75, I got asked to go to Florida to organize that state for the Democratic primary that would be on March the 9th. And I got to admit that was a big gulp that I had to take then to go down there. But
that was a very important primary.
Well, the early strategy was to do well in the Iowa caucuses, and Tim Kraft was recruited, and he went out there in probably the early spring of '75. Chris Brown was recruited for New Hampshire, which was going to be the second key state, and then Florida would be the third. Iowa to show that Carter had some strength outside of the South, New Hampshire because it is traditionally such an important first primary, and then Florida in the South to take on George Wallace and to show that Carter was a different kind of Southern politician than that. And so I think the work Tim did in Iowa, the work Chris did in New Hampshire, and what I was doing in Florida all had an interconnectedness to it, and we were able to play off of successes that each one of us had in various ways there. But I had this discussion with President Carter not too long ago. The wonderful thing about especially those early days in the campaign, that the people who decided to become supporters and work for Jimmy Carter in these states were not expecting anything in return. Carter wasn't going to win. They just believed in his values and his beliefs and where he wanted to take the country. And they were wonderful folks, and they became the nucleus of what we were able to build on. And then, you know, lo and behold, it all worked, and he won.
Well, he certainly brought a new brand of politics to the country. In addition to the candidate himself and Rosalind, the entire Carter family spread out all over the country. Yeah. And you had the Peanut Brigade, who presided over the activities of these various forces.
Well, you asked that question like you think someone did. You know, President Carter was on the road 5.5, 6 days a week, and just, you know, it's amazing the amount of energy and persistence that he has. But ultimately, he was making the greater decisions. But Hamilton Jordan and Jody, who was Powell, his press secretary, who was traveling with him, Hamilton really had been able to sketch out the overall strategy. And the great thing that I found as the year went along in 1975 and then on into 1976 was the ability to adapt without having to make any major changes in the strategy. We didn't get pushed around or pulled around or allow ourselves to get off track because of something one other candidate might have said or done. We from early on knew what we wanted to do and accomplish, and we stayed focused on it. And I think that was one of our real strengths there.
What do you remember most about that primary campaign in '76?
In the scope of the campaigns, leading up to the nomination.
Right.
You know, two or three things I think were important for me as I look back on it. One was on a personal basis, was this just incredible opportunity to get to know this country and the people in it by the different states that I got to be involved with and travel to. And a second, on a personal basis, as a Southerner, it really was satisfying to see the rest of the country come to realize that there was a different face and voice to Southern politics and Southern politicians than the caricatures that they would so much see in the media. And you know, that was a very positive thing for me. On a if you would, on a larger level, I think that Carter's message of hope and restoring integrity and honesty and faith in government was really important at that time. We had, you know, the country had suffered through the Vietnam War. You'd had Watergate with President Nixon. The folks were feeling pretty down. We had OPEC and the rise in oil prices. And I think Carter's message brought a certain level of hope about the future for folks in this country, too.
Mm-hmm. So he wins the nomination, and he moves into the general election, knowing who his opponent would be, because President Ford had succeeded President Nixon. And at that point, he could focus on issues and organization. Now, you played a key role in that election. Please tell us what you did.
Sure. And of course, President Ford was not a shoo-in to get the Republican nomination. There was a big behind-the-scenes fight at their convention in 1976. When the primaries were over and President Carter had the nomination and we had the convention in New York, I was then asked to cover our basically our southern political base, and so I was general manager of our 10 southern states, from Arkansas, Louisiana, up through Kentucky, Tennessee, and North and South Carolina, and Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida. You know, and that was again a great experience because I got to meet some wonderful folks, got to travel throughout all of those states, and you know, election night, finally at 1:30 in the morning, whatever it was, Mississippi came through, and that was the last electoral votes needed to secure the nomination. And I was feeling pretty good until I realized what the story would have been if we hadn't carried all the southern states. It would have been first Southern in 100 years who doesn't carry the South. So I've got to admit, I was glad I only thought about that after the election results were in. But yeah, so from the summer through November, that was what I did. And I worked out of our Atlanta headquarters then.
I believe that you were a member of the transition team.
I was. I went to Washington with the small group of 8 or 10 folks on that first Delta flight up to Washington with Hamilton, and you know, it was really interesting. After I'd been there about 2 weeks, I kind of figured out I didn't have a lot of reason to be there. First of all, there wasn't anything in particular that I wanted to do, but there seemed to be hundreds, if not thousands, of other people who knew exactly what they wanted to do. And I thought it'd be pretty good just to let them have at it. So the day after President Carter was inaugurated, I came back to Atlanta and got reacquainted with a lot of friends and that I had basically had to ignore for almost 2 years. Mm-hmm. And I went to CNS Bank and got a signatory loan for $3,000. A lot of money for me, especially unemployed. I paid it back, by the way, just to get that on the record. And I went to Europe. I flew mid-March. I flew to Athens, Greece, and worked my way north and west for 3 months until I came back in the early summer of '77. So I had a great 90 days roaming Europe while Hamilton and Jody and Frank Moore and all the rest of them were dealing with all those issues in Washington.
But you did go back to the White House.
President Carter was kind enough after I came back from Europe. You know, I had a credit card and those bills started coming in, and I had to figure out some way to pay them off. But they were kind enough to ask me to come to work, and went to the White House as deputy appointments secretary working for Tim Kraft, and then in May of '78, I think it was, Tim moved over to a role as political director, and I became appointments secretary and was in that position through the end of the administration.
That's like a gatekeeper for the president.
Well, it is. You know, if you wanted to see President Carter, you had to slip me $20 and I'd get you in. Yeah, it was great. You know, I was 26 at that point, I guess, and it was a wonderful time. And you know, as part of the Georgians in Washington got a lot of criticism that we weren't very professional, and some people even use that term redneck with us. And I just decided I was going to figure out a way to do this job just as best as I could. And I would meet titans of industry and movie stars and heads of state. And my role was to, frankly, get people comfortable before they went in the Oval Office, because that can be something of an intimidating space, and get them in, and when the time was up, in a polite way, end the meeting and get them out. I was in charge of when President Carter would travel anywhere. And I returned all my phone calls, I returned all the memos, nothing sat on my desk. I was the epitome of efficiency and professionalism, until President Carter got a visitor one day. And people, when they come to see the president, usually get there early, and this gentleman came to the West Wing lobby, and I went out and got him and brought him back to the little sitting area outside the Oval Office, and I just started chatting with him, and I just kind of lost it. I said, "People will not believe that I'm talking with you. Would you say hello?" And I went to my phone, which was right there in the same area, and I bet I called half a dozen friends and said, "You will not believe who's sitting here with me." And I'd hand this gentleman the phone, and he would chat with them for a minute or so to establish his credibility, and then I'd call somebody else. And finally it was time, and I got him into the Oval Office. It was Hank Aaron, and there's a hero in the world to me, it's Hank Aaron, and I just lost it that afternoon with Hank Aaron. But he was the nicest gentleman. He just put up with me, but I called about half a dozen friends and just said, "You got to talk to this person. Hank Aaron is right here with me."
It's a great story. What is a typical day for a president of the United States?
Well, you know, in the museum here at the Carter Center, the Presidential Museum, we've got a great setup so you can actually go through a day of the president's life. So I would encourage people to come see it. I'm sure the days change with each president, but President Carter was an early riser. He would usually get to the Oval Office around 7. He would have his national security briefing pretty early. There was always be some sort of a small staff meeting to look at what was coming up that day from a news or political front. A lot of time was spent looking at congressional bills and legislation that was moving along. Carter liked to keep busy. We'd have appointments through the morning, usually a working lunch. He tried to leave the office by 3:30 or 4. A lot of evenings there were always events, either visitors to the White House or conventions to go speak to, or what have you. For the Carters, Camp David became the real place where they could get away and recharge their batteries. He kept a very active schedule Monday through Fridays, and then would try to take weekends to Camp David, and that's where they could really get some rest and recharge for the coming week. But the great thing for me as a youngster, if you would, in the White House, was that no matter what you may have put to bed the night before in terms of a schedule for the day, by 9 a.m. the next day it could be totally changed around, because you have to be ready to respond to any things that happen around the world as U.S. President. You get pulled into just about everything.
How did he balance his political work with his presidency?
Well, since we didn't have a second term, you might say he didn't balance it very well sometimes. You know, President Carter, I think one of the one of the things I've heard said about him that I probably take the most umbrage for is that he was not very politically astute. I think he was, and I think he knew that there were going to be political debts to a lot of the positions he took and things that he tried to get done. But he thought they were the right things to do. And there have been many times when we would have discussions, or I would be in the room when there would be discussions about positions on particular issues or legislation, and someone would bring up the issue of what the politics is going to mean for his reelection, and he would just cut them off. He said, "That's not why I want to make this decision. I'm going to make this decision on what I think is going to be best for this country." Mm-hmm. And I think he well knew that that there were costs associated with a lot of the decisions that he made, and some he could have kicked down the road and not dealt with, but he didn't think that was his job.
He was often criticized in the media for having poor relations with the Congress. Yeah. Is that a justifiable accusation?
Sure. Well, you know, there are 3 or 4 ways, I guess, to look at that. You know, first, if you just look at a percentage basis, what you find is that he was very successful in terms of getting things through Congress. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't ruffle some feathers sometimes when you make that happen. You had another issue there in that he was then turning around and working with a number of people that he had defeated during the presidential primary season. You had a number of very powerful people in both the House and the Senate side that he had beaten in primaries, and so there was probably some ill feeling as a result of that. And third, you know, President Carter, again, didn't worry that much about his politics, and so he didn't always worry much about somebody else's politics. He felt if this was the right thing to do, you ought to go out there and vote the way he saw you needed to. Mm-hmm. I think he had some great relationships with different members of Congress, but I think there's some that we probably could have spent more time on. But you know, he wanted to get things done.
2 issues that crippled him: the economy and the hostage situation.
Sure.
They preyed heavily on his mind.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, the economy with the rise in the price of oil and the issues that came out of the first 73 embargo that was still around, and the formation of OPEC and the control of the flow of oil had a major impact on the economy and the inflation, and really did hurt. I think his decision to bring Paul Volcker into the Federal Reserve was, again, the right decision for the country, but probably was not the right decision politically for him. He knew what Paul Volcker was going to do. He knew he needed to tighten the money flow and liquidity, and did that, and that's when inflation started going up. And President Reagan and his administration, frankly, were able to benefit from the harsh things that had to be done in the late 70s. The hostage crisis was a terrible ordeal for everyone. The only good thing that came out of that is that every one of those hostages came home free and for the most part unharmed. There were a few that were tortured, but I think they recovered too. But every one of those hostages came home.
Before we get to the election in 1980, I want to ask you about Hamilton Jordan. How was it working with Hamilton Jordan?
Ask me that question again now. How did you put that? How was it what?
Working with.
With. That's important because you did that. Hamilton, you worked with Hamilton. You never worked for Hamilton. He was, a great character, wonderful heart. This was a guy who cared so much. The sense of humor and the camaraderie he could build with people was just unbelievable. Sometimes he wasn't quite as organized as you might have wished, but he more than made up for that in his insights and his smartness, and it's just his general good attitude and cheer. We the 75, 76 time period, especially 75, we weren't on TV every night. I mean, we were the unknown, and Hamilton really kept people's spirits up during that time when we were building the momentum to carry us through Iowa and New Hampshire and Florida and on to the nomination. But he just had a great skill in keeping people motivated, making you feel important, and he was a great strategist. He could figure out political moves very well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a delight.
So Hamilton, then I think you could say, took a Jimmy Who and made him governor of Georgia and president of the United States.
Yeah, you could say that. I expect Governor and President Carter would tell you he might have had a little bit of hand in it also. but yeah, Hamilton figured out how to maneuver around. One of the great things in the presidential campaign was understanding the rules early on and how you went about getting delegates. And he understood those rules probably better than anyone else in the country at that point in time. And knew how to build a strategy around rounding up whatever that final number of delegates is you needed to get a nomination.
Mm-hmm. That the primaries of that year were somewhat contested, but President Carter continued to be president and didn't actually get too involved in the politics. Isn't that right?
In 1980,
yes.
Even in the re-election effort. President Carter had his legislative agenda that he was still looking at getting passed. He had the economic issues that he was dealing with. You had the hostage crisis that began exactly 1 year before the general election date. There were, as Hamilton has described it, and I think aptly so, that last year in the White House, there were two things going on. There were just two parallel governments. One is the day-to-day that a president needs to do, and the hostage crisis. And President Carter was having to deal with both of them simultaneously. And the issues facing the country at that point in time were not simple and were not easy ones. And again, he didn't run from any of those. There could have been ways to deflect some of this or put some things off to a second term, but he just kept taking them on. I remember the hard fight on the Panama Canal treaties and to get those done, and the political toll that took not only on him but so many others. And the afternoon that the final vote was taken and they passed in the legislature, everybody said, "Well, let's celebrate." And we had about a 15-minute celebration, and then Carter looked around and said, "Okay, what's the next thing on the agenda? Let's get back to it, folks." I mean, he wanted to get things done. He was a workaholic.
Right. So what happened after that, Phil? President Carter was not reelected. It was a sad time for most Georgians, and I'm sure for you.
Yeah.
What did you do after that?
Well, the day after the election defeat, President Carter was kind enough to ask me to consider planning their move back to Georgia, and so I was able to immediately throw myself into that. I kiddingly tell people, since I took a pass on the first few months of the administration by going to Europe, I picked it up at the back end and did that. So I came back to Georgia with them for about almost a year through October of '81, and we had we started with a staff of 25 who made the move down, and over time that dwindled down. We had offices in the 75 Spring Street building, the federal building there. Mm-hmm. We had, it was an unfinished floor, so we had to build that out quickly and get space. And then began the planning of what became the Carter Center with the Presidential Library and Museum. And we worked on that through October. One of Carter's last acts as governor was to sign an executive order that stopped the building of what was to be the Stone Mountain Expressway, which was coming right through the area that we're sitting in. And the state had already decided to build it, and they had acquired about 300 acres through here, which was at the time the largest piece of undeveloped area in any major city. And Governor Busby, who came in as governor after Carter, had put together a blue ribbon panel of citizens to decide how best to use this land. And so when Carter came back to Georgia, Busby approached him about thinking about a site here for the library museum. And he had a wonderful gentleman named Frank Jones chairing that commission. Frank was from a attorney family in Macon, but he was with King and Spalding at the time. And I remember one early spring morning, it must have been maybe early April, that we met up at Spring Street, 75 Spring Street, with Frank Jones, and he wanted to come over and look at the spot with the Carters. And so we had a Atlanta police car in the lead, and then the car with the Carters and Frank Jones, and then a Secret Service follow-up, and then a staff car that I think one other person were in, and then I think we had another police car at the end. And this place was totally overgrown. Any buildings on it had already been demolished, and it was just oak trees with kudzu hanging off of it and kudzu patches. But there was a little dirt trail up to the highest point on this land, which is the second highest point in Atlanta, as a matter of fact, and a big old oak tree. And so we pull around the last curve and we get in there, and there's a car sitting there, and the car's rocking back and forth, and all the two heads pop up, and we've come on a couple having a nooner right there, and they look up and they see a police car and a black limousine and a follow-up, and Frank Jones loves to tell that story, and he says, and that's the spot that the idea for the Carter Center was conceived. I've always chuckled at that. We lost Mr. Jones a couple of years ago to cancer, but he was a great gentleman and a great friend and supporter. Became one of the trustees of the Carter Center. But yeah, that was how we came to have this as a site for the center.
If you would just briefly explain to us the real mission of the Carter Center and what you've accomplished so far.
Oh, sure. Glad to do that. You know, our slogan is waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope. And I think that really does encapsulate what's happened. Well, the Carters knew at their age that they still had a number of years to go, and they really wanted to continue to do things. And so they wanted much more than just a library and museum. They wanted an active organization. And so he became a distinguished professor at Emory University. Dr. Jim Laney, who was president of Emory at that time, was a great friend and supporter, and they had some office space to get started at the Emory campus, and then these facilities were built and opened on October 1, 1986. And the Carters spent some time looking at places that they felt they could make an impact. And the first few years were a little bit hit and miss trying different things, but by the early 90s, I think enough of a nucleus of activities were really starting to begin to see they could make a difference. And so on the health side, a number of people like Dr. Bill Fagey, who had been at the CDC here in Atlanta, and some retired CDC folks came over and joined up to start looking at what have become called neglected tropical diseases. They weren't that at the time, but they were looked at one disease, guinea worm. But we found that there were ways to improve the lives and reduce the suffering of millions of people, especially in the third world, by some very simple drugs and simple techniques. And so as a result of over 30 years of effort, one disease, guinea worm, has almost been eradicated. River blindness disease has been eliminated from the Americas, and we're making great efforts now in Africa with that. Diseases like lymphatic filariasis and schistosomiasis are starting to become under control in a number of countries. Malaria has really been reduced in the last few years. These are all things that the center has either played a real leadership role in or very much a partnership role in helping to deal with. On the peace side, we've really become known as setting the standard for international election observations around the world. We've now done 99 elections in 38 states, and we're about to do our 100th election sometime this year. But there's also been very involved in the conflict resolution work, and President Carter continues to look at ways to have an impact across the globe in various intra-country disputes. So it's just been amazing records. He's 90, she's 87, and they still show no signs of wanting to slow down.
Mm-hmm. So you've been here the whole period?
I took about 10 years down in Florida after 81 and went to work with some great friends there. And then there was a Florida politician named Lawton Childs who had been a U.S. Senator, and in 1988 had been one of the first politicians to admit to depression. He just said, "I'm tired of dealing with these issues in Washington." He came back to his home state, and it was a time when a whole new group of drugs to treat depression came along, including Prozac. He was very successfully treated and said, "I'm ready to get back in politics." He ran for governor and won, and he asked me to join his staff, and so in 91 I moved to Tallahassee from Orlando and went to work for Governor Childs, and I stayed there until 94 when I finally met Allison, who gave me the great honor of agreeing to marry me, and so she could move to Atlanta with her job, and the Carters were kind enough to ask me to come back to work with them. So I've been back now 21 years.
21 years.
Yeah.
How do you describe your job here?
Anything that's broken around the Carter Center will eventually get to me.
You're the man. You're the man. Good. Phil, I see our time has run out. We'd like to talk to you more about your career and the Carters, and maybe we can do that in the future.
Oh, that'd be terrific.
But I want to thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of the University of Georgia and Young Harris College.
Well, you're kind. I'm glad I could be a part of this, and congratulations on this project. I think it's terrific to preserve memories while people still have them.
Thank you so much.
All right.